So last video we left off talking about this concept of redlining, which is essentially when lenders, bankers, etc. refuse or deny loans or mortgages to individuals or to businesses that are predominantly located in minority communities. So one example of this study compared the loans that were approved and denied to individuals on the basis of their race. So it's comparing loans that were approved or denied to applicants who are white, Latino, and African American. And we can see this first section of bars here represents applicants whose that were denied a mortgage, and if their income was below the median within this particular sample for this study. So we can see that only 15% of white people who had an income that was below average for this particular sample were denied a mortgage, in comparison to 30% of African Americans and 25% of Latinos, right? Now, interestingly, when applicants in this sample had an income that was above the median or above average, we see that only 11% of white people got denied mortgage, which makes sense. If you have a higher income, right, if your income was higher than average, we would expect you would probably be less likely to be denied a loan. But we see that even for people of color, for Latinos and African Americans, even if their income was higher than what was average or typical of this particular sample of people that were recruited for this study, that had no effect on their likelihood of getting approved for a mortgage. They still experienced the same denial rates in comparison to individuals whose income was below average for this sample. Another interesting finding from this study, these applicants were charged higher interest given their subprime loans. So we can see that African Americans and Latinos, 36% of Latinos and 43% of African Americans respectively, were charged higher interest rates in comparison to only 14% of white people who were approved for loans. So not only are African Americans, Latinos, and people of color less likely to be approved for loans, when they are approved for loans, they're more likely to get charged with higher interest rates. And the interesting thing here is that this was just looking at people, applicants who applied for loans, who had 100 to 100% of the average income. So it's not we can't justify this by saying, oh, well, maybe they got charged a higher interest rate because they had less income, because they were of lower socioeconomic status and they were of greater risk. No, that wasn't the case. These people had the same income as these white folks, but only 14% of white folks were charged these higher interest rates in this study, in comparison to 30 to 40% of people of color in the same study, right? Employers are also less likely to hire people of color than white people. Again, there's a really infamous study conducted a while ago that found that white-sounding names on resumes are more likely to get callbacks for interviews in comparison to black-sounding names. And this again proves that even though it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, the subliminal racism that we have been internalized to possess in our society that values whiteness and devalues blackness affects our subconscious and therefore affects our behaviors, sometimes without us even being cognizant of it, which is what makes institutionalized racism so tricky to identify and for white people to recognize and acknowledge in our society today, because we don't want to think that we're racist. Maybe we really don't believe that we are, but subliminally we cannot deny this mountain of empirical evidence that proves the contrary. It's important to note that racial discrimination in employment and housing is technically illegal in the US, yet study after study after study continues to find that it occurs today. Right? Let's take one more look here, one last example, and then I'll wrap up this discussion on all of the evidence of institutionalized racism in the field of sociology and other social sciences. Let's take a broader look at this to understand how things like redlining, right? How things like racial steering come to affect our holistic lived experiences. All right, these are maps of the city of Chicago. All right, and you can see this map on the left here is showing the property values of different neighborhoods in Chicago. Each of these little blocks in here represents a different neighborhood. All right, and the first thing we'll see down here, if we look at our key, I know this is kind of tiny, the darker green blocks represent neighborhoods that have the highest property values in Chicago, while the lighter colored blocks that get closer to white represent the poorest property values, the lowest property values in the neighborhoods of Chicago. All right, so what we can see here is that there's this pretty clear belt here on kind of the south side of Chicago, verging up into the central western part of Chicago, that is very lightly colored in comparison to the very densely colored dark green area up here. So this area, this dark green area, is commonly referred to as the Golden Coast in Chicago. This is the wealthy part of Chicago. Cost of living here very high. As a result, property values very high on the Golden Coast and up into the northern and northwestern suburbs of Chicago. The south side of Chicago and the central west part of Chicago, notoriously much poor, impoverished neighborhoods, as we see by the property values here. All right, this next map in the purple is showing us the quality of schools for the different neighborhoods in Chicago. All right, now same premise here. The darker color the purple is, the higher quality those schools are. All right, so let's look at this here. What comparisons can we make between this first map, the green one showing the property values of Chicago, and this second map, the purple one, showing the quality of schools? If I asked you as a sociologist to analyze these maps, what conclusion could you draw about these two maps? Well, you might notice that there's a fairly similar pattern of shading taking place here. We see that the lowest property values in Chicago appear to be predominantly in the south side, verging into the central western part of Chicago, and we see a very similar thing happening here in terms of the quality of schools. The schools in the south side of Chicago and in the west central part of Chicago appear to be of the lowest quality, the worst quality. Okay, now the reason behind that is because public schools are funded in the United States by property tax dollars. So the more expensive your housing property is in any given neighborhood, the more property taxes you pay, and therefore the more funding that the schools in your neighborhood or in your independent school district receive. All right? We'll talk more about this in a few weeks when we discuss education from a sociological perspective. But now let's just keep this pattern in our minds. Lower property values associated with lower quality schools. This third map here now is showing us crime rates in Chicago. And this time it's reversed. The darker the blue, the higher the crime rates. So the lighter the blue or the closer to white, the lower the crime rates are. And again, what patterns are we seeing? Look at and compare and contrast these three maps now. What are we seeing? Well, we see that the lower the property values, the poorer quality the schools are, the higher rates of crime in those neighborhoods. Now, why might this be? Well, if your education system is garbage, right? If we have poor teachers who are underqualified, who aren't motivating their students, who are suspending and expelling students at higher rates for punitive reasons, the more likely we are going to have young adults on the streets, people of lower socioeconomic status, maybe not able to get jobs in similar ways, resort to lives of crime, things like drug dealing in order to put food on the table for their families. And again, we see this as nowhere near significant of a problem up in the Golden Coast in this rich part of Chicago where property values are higher, quality of education is higher, and crime rates are substantially lower. Now, the last piece of this puzzle that we should look at is the racial demographics of Chicago, all right? So here we see how race is mapped into Chicago here. The blue dots in this map represent white residents. The black dots represent African American or Black residents. The red represent Asian, and the orange represent Hispanic. All right. Now, think like a sociologist here. What can we see? What connections are we drawing here? Probably unsurprisingly to you at this point, we see that people of color, predominantly African Americans and Hispanic people, are more likely to live in this region of Chicago that has the lowest property values, that has the poorest quality of schools, and subsequently has the highest rates of crime. Now, this isn't coincidental, right? And this isn't to say that Black people are just more likely to commit crime. That wouldn't be looking at the whole story here. We need to take into consideration the wealth disparity that's affecting this here, the wealth inequality that we see. We need to look at the educational inequality we see. And what studies tell us is that being Black isn't a significant predictor of whether or not you're going to be more or less likely to commit crime. Black people, people of color, may be more likely to be convicted of crimes because of the racial inequalities that prevent them from accruing wealth at the same rates as white people, and the negative schooling, the improper and insufficient schooling that they receive as a result, which subsequently affects their ability to accrue wealth, which would enable them to avoid lives of crime in the first place. Right? So this is all connected, right? As sociologists, we can never just look at one variable. We can never just look at race in a vacuum and understand the whole story. That's why we need our sociological imaginations to take us up in those hot air balloons so we can see the whole story. This intersectional story here is what is necessary to really grasp the complexities of how race and racism negatively affects the lived experiences of people of color in our society today, and why it's difficult for people of color to escape racism, to improve their quality of life and achieve upward social mobility at the same degree or the same rate as white people, because white people don't have to deal with all of this garbage the same way that people of color do. And again, I'm not saying that this is a story that can be said to be true for all people of all races. Some white people do experience income inequalities. Some white people do live in these poor neighborhoods and have poor schooling and experience crime. But again, they're not subject to it structurally, institutionally, in the same ways that people of color are, because white people did not live with the history of racism in the United States. In other words, being white is not going to be a factor that increases an individual's likelihood of living in poverty, of going to poor school, or of being participating in crime. However, for people of color, we cannot say that that same thing isn't true because of their historical institutionalized disenfranchisement in the United States. All right. So again, it's really important that we take this ride up in our hot air balloons, that we look at this from a sociological perspective and try and see how all of these social structures and institutions in our society are connected to one another. And we have to have a historical understanding of these institutions in order for us to make sense of how they're affecting us today.